Canadian investment funds to Chinese equities and bonds linked to human rights violations for the first hour before going in camera for committee business. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. For the benefit of the witnesses and members, a few comments as we start. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I can inform the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. So I would like to welcome Mr. Schmale, who's wearing kind of a blank look right now, but I'm sure he will be joining us in due course. And with that, we can now start to welcome our witnesses for this first hour. As individuals, we have appearing Carl Breaux, Chief Executive Officer of CACN Incorporated, Dr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow, Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad in the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and Margaret McQuaig-Johnson, Senior Fellow, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and Institute of Science, Society and Policy, University of Ottawa. Mr. Breaux, we'll start with you for 5 minutes of your opening statement. Keep an eye on your monitor. Unless you've got yourself timed out, I'll give you the old standard floor director's just about time to wrap it up signal. But you can begin now for 5 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So, hi, my name is Carl Breaux. I'm the CEO of companies Numax and Simon. Both are active in electronics and electromechanical products manufacturing, both in Canada and in China. Total revenue about $20 million. So I'm a Canadian citizen. I'm an engineer. I speak French, English, and I can actually speak, read and write in Chinese Mandarin, although my writing in Mandarin sort of looks like a 5-year-old. I live in Canada, but I also own a home in Shanghai, China, where I spend a lot of time. I'm a business mentor for many entrepreneurs in Canada, USA, and China. I'm actually an associate and mentor at Creative Destruction Lab in Canada. I was also nominated as an MBA program learning mentor at the China-Europe International Business School in Shanghai, which is generally recognized as the highest ranked MBA program in Asia. And finally, I'm a certified board member. I have board membership experience both in Canada and China. I hold patents and trademarks in China. I received the Canadian Council of Engineer Medal for Exceptional Achievement by a young engineer. I'm no longer young, so I guess that was some time ago. Some things I would like to address. On the topic of supply chain traceability, transparency, and best practices, well, I would say that overall the business environment in China is actually very transparent. Accounting is based on FAPIAO accounting, meaning that all transactions are recorded at the tax office at the time they occur. Most company information is public, readily accessible, including legal records, ownership structures, labor disputes, a number of employees, credit ratings, etc. Supply chain best practices in China, which I can also witness to, are actually the same pretty much as everywhere else, just that maybe language and distance can make things a little bit more complex. So here, key is to do proper due diligence, do a mapping of your supply chain, sort of knowing who you're buying from, but also knowing who you're buying from is buying from. You need to do frequent audits of your suppliers or partners, which in some cases can be done remotely using recent technology, a little bit like today. Let's be reminded that we're buyers or investors in most of the examples here, so we can actually require all the transparency that we want. So if we're not happy, well, we don't need to buy or invest in China. So as buyers, we can set the traceability protocols, we can have any compliance requirements that we need. Having said that, I would also like to emphasize the importance of building enforceable, clear, detailed contracts with your business partners in China or really anywhere around the world. So all of these are common practice. So I like to tell my business friends when they come to China, please don't leave your brain on the plane. Do things the way you think they should be done, no matter where you are. And finally, supply chain management. I think technology can help. There's blockchain tools now, which are more and more common to be able to help with traceability. Of course, remote auditing, online QC tools have evolved considerably in the last few years. Access to live camera feeds in working areas is sometimes possible. A few words on corporate compliance and responsibility from my perspective. So in China, there's the notion of company legal representative, which is a person, which is generally a company director. The company legal representative, as the name implies, has significant personal legal responsibilities with regards to the operations of companies and compliance. So this is an important role to understand and manage properly. So-called registered capital gaps set the investor's financial responsibilities in case of default with employees or suppliers. So you need to understand that. Essentially, it's the difference between the amount set as registered capital requirement and the actual capital invested into the company, and that sort of difference sets the remaining potential responsibility of investors in China, which can be significant. A person cannot declare personal bankruptcy in China, so that creates the extra level of responsibility. So whatever personal debts or responsibilities arise from some of the issues above, a person actually cannot escape from them in China. I would like to put a few words on cascading or firewalling. It's very common for Canadian companies investing into China to actually do that through another company in between, in a place, for example, like Singapore. That shields the Canadian company from most of its responsibilities and for its investment in China. So it's considered good practice because it protects investors. But at the same time, it sort of disengages investors from their responsibilities in foreign countries, including China. So that can be a little bit of a dilemma. Finally, on the topic of living and doing business in China, so I think China is a good place to do business in full compliance with international standards. I mean, it comes back to who's managing and making decisions. I feel totally safe here when I'm in China, both as a business owner and my private life. I do feel that there's considerable bias in how information about China is reported in the news and social media. So I personally don't rely very much on this often distorted information to make any decision. And I sure hope I can make a positive contribution to this committee. Thank you very much for having me and for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Breaux. We'll now turn to Dr. Burton for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
You're on mute, Dr. Burton.
I think can you hear me now?
Yes. You can start
Excellent.
again.
Okay.
You're on mute again. Are you using the space bar to unmute yourself there, or? I'll tell you what, we'll let you play with that, and instead, perhaps...
I think I'm okay now.
You're okay now? Okay.
I think so.
Start again from the top. Thank you.
Okay. Canada's new Indo-Pacific policy defines China as an increasingly disruptive global power. Others of our like-minded democratic allies are using more straightforward language, identifying that their national policy should regard China as a strategic competitor or systemic rival. Reading over a lot of the evidence given to this committee, I judge that what we're really talking about here is China as an emerging strategic adversary. Now, China's geostrategic agenda is shaped by the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, expounded by its General Secretary, Xi Jinping, which is transparently hostile to Canada and the West's liberal values. China as a nation and Chinese culture and the Chinese people are not what this is about. But right now, we have to recognize that the Communist Party is what it is. As China's 2017 revision of the constitution of their party makes clear, the party exercises overall leadership over all areas of endeavor in every part of the country. As Xi Jinping has put it, quoting Chairman Mao actually, party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center. The party leads everything. A commentary by the official Xinhua news agency on this statement by Mr. Xi says that the party exercises overall leadership in all areas of endeavor in this country. So, the People's Republic of China, Chinese Communist Party regime is an integrated party, state, military, security, industrial complex under which, as they put it, the party's leadership is absolute, powerful, comprehensive, and unified. So all business enterprises in China are subject to the direction and coordination by the Chinese Communist Party and are able to be deployed for non-commercial regime strategic purposes. And we see a lot of this, unfortunately. There are no Chinese industrial commercial enterprises existing independently from China's party state, while some important Chinese businesses such as Huawei are not deemed state-owned enterprises as such. They are still integral components of China's Communist Party regime, integrated to the overall purposes of the Chinese Communist Party state. That's why we're not allowing the Huawei 5G software and hardware into our Canadian telecommunications networks. Moreover, Chinese enterprises can reciprocally draw on Chinese military and intelligence services to get technology and data to their commercial advantage, as there is compelling evidence that Huawei, for example, has done. So China's integrated regime is able to mobilize business relations to further its purposes in a variety of aspects, and let me mention a few. First of all, technology transfer. There are many examples of the foreign party's technology or proprietary manufacturing processes being transferred to the Chinese regime. Espionage. The mobilization of Chinese businesses to facilitate espionage is well established, leaving aside the provision of China's intelligence law requiring all Chinese citizens to collaborate with security and intelligence when called upon to do so. The integrated nature of the regime allows for smooth melding of profit motive and pursuit of geostrategic advantage. The latter always trumps economic benefit. Then we have economic coercion and retaliation for states that have unfriendly, as China deems it, policies. So we see economic coercion by the Chinese regime to pressure foreign governments to comply with Chinese non-economic demands on them. For example, when the South Korea Lotte conglomerate had the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense Missile Defense System designed to counter the North Korean missile threats installed on a Lotte golf course, Lotte's operations in China were affected by simultaneous close down of its operations of its many department stores in China on false grounds of fire code violations. And we all know about the Canadian canola seed producers who had their contracts with China violated on false claims that their product was contaminated by non-seed matter. We also have support of illegal police operations in foreign nations. As our government has observed, Chinese businesses in Canada have sent false letters of invitation to facilitate fraudulent visa applications by Chinese police to enter Canada to engage in illegal activities. And then we have the enforcement of discourse power, where several multilateral companies have had to correct, as one might put it, their website and issue apologies for non-compliance with Chinese regime discourse, that the Taiwan government is an illegitimate rogue regime that will be returned to the embrace of the motherland as a Chinese province and rule from Beijing. For example, the Marriott Hotel website was blocked in China until they ceased to identify Taiwan as a separate market for their hotel business. Let me just conclude by saying that investment by Canada in Chinese business carries the risk of our becoming complicit in all of these things that I've mentioned above, even if rigorous due diligence is done before investment is made. So I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. We'll now go to Margaret McQuaig-Johnston. And before I start the clock, perhaps you can share with us the story of your white ribbon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I too am wearing a white ribbon, as many MPs are, for December 6th. That's because I was the director responsible for women in science and engineering in 1989 when the Polytechnique attack took place. And it was MPs themselves who started wearing the white ribbon at that moment, and others like myself followed suit. I've kept my white ribbon all these years, and I bring it out every year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, now to the business at hand.
Thank you, and thanks to the committee for inviting me to present today. I come to this issue from the perspective of one who has tracked Chinese technology developments for decades. But I've also closely followed human rights issues in China since 1979 when I went to the Xiden Democracy Wall in Beijing to talk to the workers and the students there. China is now using advanced technology surveillance equipment against the Uyghur people, but also in Tibet, Mongolia, and against members of Christian house churches across China. What would Canadians think if they knew that the CPPIB has more than $1 billion of their dollars invested in Tencent, which owns WeChat, which is being used to monitor and censor the communications of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and zero-COVID protesters? The company Alibaba makes video cameras that look down from every corner in the crowded cells of Uyghurs in indoctrination camps and prisons. What would those Uyghurs think if they knew that Canadian pensioners had invested in those video cameras? Its software is also designed to pick a Uyghur out of a crowd. Newsoft is a Chinese tech firm that was asked to build a system to target journalists, migrant women, and international students so that public security authorities can quickly locate them and obstruct their work. Both CPPIB and the Caisse de dépôt have investments in Newsoft. This committee learned last week that CPPIB invests in 2 Morgan Stanley indices that include 13 companies making money from the genocide. The board says that they don't invest directly in those companies, but they have said they do invest in index funds, giving exposure to as many as 10,000 securities in very small amounts, only $1 million or $2, sometimes even smaller. Those are their words. We're often told by CPPIB that the board invests in companies, not in countries. But when Chinese authorities ask a company to design even more repressive surveillance equipment to use against certain categories of citizens, that argument falls apart. Companies in China fall under government direction, not just market forces. And they now all have Communist Party committees that are increasingly active in decision-making. I have several recommendations. First, we need an entities list as the U.S. has, prohibiting Canadian investment in named Chinese genocide and forced labor companies. It does not need to be the same list as the Americans have, but it must be focused on companies serving the Uyghur genocide and the surveillance state. Second, pension and university funds in Canada must be transparent about their investments in China. For example, if a Chinese surveillance company wants a confidentiality, CPPIB respects that. And it does not publish information that is commercially sensitive in some circumstances. These practices obscure investments that are harming human rights. Third, pension funds must be willing to engage in discussion with civil society about their investments. They may say they use an ethical lens, but what informs that lens when company policy forbids the investment managers from meeting Canadians to hear their concerns firsthand? Any such meetings are with a communications officer, seemingly to keep a PR lid on the discussion. Fourth, while private investors may pursue the highest return independent of ethics, for a Crown corporation investing public monies, there's a higher bar, especially when the government identifies human rights as a principal concern. Its code of ethics should be mandated by the government, whether federal or provincial. Finally, I would hope that pension funds and universities are now looking more broadly at the economic and geopolitical risks with Chinese investments, including the tech sector, real estate, unexpected regulations, and threats against Taiwan. I believe that our pension funds and university trust funds are smart enough to make the transition that would put themselves on the right side of Canadians' ethics as well as their wallets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McQuaig-Johnson. We'll now go to our first round of questioning and to Ms. Dancho for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses for being here today. Quite an interesting background from all of you, and certainly your opening remarks were very diverse and very informative. Miss McQuaig-Johnston, I do have a few questions for you. You outlined quite clearly that Canada's CPP, our pension plan, is invested in companies that use quite, I think, perhaps incredible or advanced surveillance technology that's capable of picking out, you mentioned specifically Uyghurs, and say a big group of people if this technology is engaged, which is certainly extremely concerning, particularly in light of what we've all learned of what they're doing to the Uyghur population. And you also rightly pointed out that the government, one of their primary values is human rights. So with your expertise and your knowledge, what sort of grade would you provide the Canadian government of living up to that key value in terms of our investments with our pension or other public dollars that are going to these types of companies? What grade would you give them?
I would give them a D, and the reason is that they have not yet done enough to ensure that their funds are not going towards these genocide companies. And I do give them some credit. They did move out of the investment in direct investment in iFlyTech. iFlyTech is a company that does voice recognition technology, and Uyghurs are all taken to their local police station so that their voice can be recorded in different modulations so that the police will understand who exactly is speaking on telephone calls when they listen in. So I was very pleased, and in fact, in an op-ed, I commended the CPPIB for moving out of that investment. But unfortunately, I've learned that iFlyTech is captured under one of the index funds that they do invest in. And so that, it's a continuing concern. And it's not enough just to stand back and invest in a broad set of funds that include genocide companies. You have to look at every single one of the companies to ensure that it's not one of those contributing to the Uyghur genocide. It's unconscionable, in my view, to have technology that's funded by Canadians being used against Uyghurs. It's remarkably tragic.
Thank you very much for that answer. I very much appreciate that. I'd like to ask the same question of Mr. Burton. Wonderful to see you again. Thank you for being here. What grade would you provide the current government for living up to their values of human rights in terms of what we're talking about today in investments of our pension plan in these various Chinese companies and others?
Well, I think that Margaret's D is perhaps a little generous. We really have to be much more aware of the implications of our investment in terms of whether we're enabling a regime which is potentially hostile to us. And so, I quite agree with Margaret about the technologies that are being used to enable the Uyghur genocide. But I think there are a lot of other areas in which we, unless we really are on top of exactly where the money is going and who is using it, can be used for methods that are hostile both to our values and to Canada's national interests. So I'd like to see, if we're going to invest in China, a lot more government supervision of what our pension plans and university endowments are doing.
I suppose one of the questions sounds like we're hearing from investors and those on the CPP investment or CPPIB, pardon me, which I believe is Investment Board. I believe is what it stands for. So that in particular, they're saying, well, it's only a few $million here and there, and it's kind of through an index fund, and sort of, it sounds like I haven't spoken to them personally, but it sounds like they're making excuses from what you've shared, Ms. McQuaig-Johnston and Mr. Burton, from your feedback. So would you say that this is something doable? Like, could Canada say, we are not investing any taxpayer dollars or any public programs in anything that is harming any of the groups that are marginalized and abused and frankly engaging in a genocide against the Uyghurs and others? Is that actually a doable thing? Can we achieve that as a country if we put our mind to it?
I prefer that, our pension plans look elsewhere for profitable investments. But if, we're insisting that we're going to continue to, on the one hand, regard China as a systemic rival, on the first part of the week and the latter part of the week say that we can engage with them, then we really have to be going about this with much more care and transparency than we're seeing. But I think any investments in China is potentially going against Canadian interests because we don't have control over what the Communist Party directs Chinese companies to do.
And over to you, Ms. McCraig Johnston. Am I saying your last name right? Is it McCraig? Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
Thank you. So, we probably can't do it overnight, so that next week we have a clean slate, but we can do it quickly. We have talented investment managers in these funds. They're paid a lot of money. They're given incentives for increased profits of the funds. They need to be incented for good governance and for human rights. And so this is it should be a target of every board. And the obvious ones are to get out of Tencent and Alibaba. Both of those companies are very complicit in human rights infringement across China. And so those are the number ones. And then they need to be able to take a look at these index funds. It seems bizarre to have an organization called Hong Kong Watch, based in London, England, telling CPPIB what their investments are by the dollar in a range of 13 different genocide companies. And surely the investment managers themselves know that. They should be able to get themselves out of those investments and move to different funds. So I don't think it would happen overnight, but I think it could happen within a month or two.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stancho. We'll now go to Mr. Fragaskatos for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you Thank you to our witnesses. Professor McQuaig Johnson, I recognize that the investment board of the CPP is independent, and I don't want to get into the particulars on that, but I think it's important to put on the record that it does not operate at the dictates of the Canadian government. But I do want to delve into some of your remarks, and hopefully you can build upon them by giving us an understanding of what other countries have done as far as their investment boards in respect to pensions or other ways of investing that you think that Canada should look at, recognizing, of course, that in other countries too, in democracies, investment boards operate independently. Do you have thoughts on other models, basically, is my question?
Yeah, the UK and France and Germany have a better track record on this than we do. And I know there's a lot of exchange among the various boards and pension funds. So I know that they have an ability to learn from those best practices. And they're well documented in the recent report of Hong Kong Watch, which looks at a range of countries, including the U.S. and Canada.
Thank you very much. Let me just change focus for a moment. On November 29th, you wrote an op-ed for the Globe and Mail, and you put forward a number of points, but you kind of, if I understood you correctly, you kind of give an understanding or a view on where China is headed in light of the protests that have materialized there in recent weeks. Can you share that with the committee, your point of view on where China could be going?
Well, I'm very concerned about where China's going. I have many good friends in China, and I look at the zero COVID policy and the effect that's had on human rights of people being forced to stay home for months on end. The Uyghurs have been home since August without adequate food replenishment. And so I've been concerned about that. Now we're seeing that the National Health Commission is starting to ease up on some of the COVID restrictions. That's good to see in terms of the zero COVID constraints. But the really concerning thing is that they haven't got vaccines that will protect their population. Most of their seniors are not fully vaccinated. The vaccines they are using are less than effective. And it seems that it's been offered to them, but they have not accepted accept the mRNA vaccines from the West. Xi Jinping is very much invested in his zero COVID policy and doesn't want, it seems, to take vaccines from the West. They're going to have to do it, or there are going to be millions of deaths, and it's really going to put a big strain on their hospital system.
Thank you very much. I asked the question as a way to get back to what I first raised in terms of models of other countries with respect to investments. Last week at our committee, we heard testimony on that, and the German model was explored and, in fact, pointed to as probably one of the most progressive ways that a country can address the question of investment. It's not a law that's active yet, but it will come into force very soon. So what you just told us is concerning in terms of China's current and potential future direction. One of the issues that came up in committee last week also was the challenge of administering that law. So clearly the law that the Germans are moving ahead with, or seem to be moving ahead with, is based on an ethical standard, and I commend them for it. But no law is going to be effective unless it can be administered. And there's questions about how exactly that law will be administered. It's very difficult to see going forward its efficacy. So if you could, do you have any thoughts on that question, the question of administration?
I have every confidence that if Canada accepted the same approach, we would be able to implement it efficiently. I have tremendous respect for Heather Monroe-Bloom, who's the chair of the CPPIB, and for their senior managers, very, very professional, solid people. I don't see a problem with administering a policy that has at its core a higher bar of ethics. And I think because these are public monies, CPPIB is a Crown corporation. I take your point that the government can't intervene and say, fund this and don't fund that. But I think it sets a broader standard of human rights within which Crown corporations must operate.
Thank you very much. I see that I have 45 seconds left. Mr. Breau, I wanted to ask you a question, but it's limited now. So can you put a number of things to us. Could you summarize your testimony into one recommendation if you were to leave this committee with one key thought for us to consider? What would it be?
So I would think that my main recommendation would be that if, for example, we decide to move into a direction of putting in place a new law or reinforcing more compliance or getting more visibility or traceability of things that are happening in China in terms of business or purchasing, not to be afraid that those laws or things can be implemented in China. They can be. And I think that would be the main thing I would like to recommend, not to be under the impression that doing business in China or the legal systems or the way things are happening here will not allow these things to be able to be implemented efficiently. I think that would be my 30-second comment on your pertinent question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Franciscados. We'll now go to Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes or less.
Bonjour, merci.
Hello, and thank you, Chair. Welcome to all witnesses. Thank you for being with us today in this late meeting. Thank you for your contribution to our deliberations. Mr. Breau, I must tell you that regardless of whether or not this was your absolute right to express yourself in whichever official language you choose, I must say that I was somewhat disappointed not to hear you speak in the language of Molière, since you had indicated that you do speak French very well. You know that there are not very many French-speaking members on this committee, and when we have French-speaking witnesses, we are eager to hear the language of Molière in committee. It doesn't happen very often. Now, regardless of this, I have a question for you, a very simple one. You know, as has just been mentioned, Parliament is juggling with the idea of adopting legislation, asking for accountability from Canadian businesses operating in China, among other places, regarding their supply chains, their investments, to ensure that the operations are ethical and that they avoid forced labor, exploitation of the environment. How do you, in your operations of your businesses and your investments, how do you ensure that you are not dealing with forced labor or violations of social, environmental rights, etc.? Do you have any such concerns? And if so, how are you able to control this?
D'abord, merci effectivement de me donner l'opportunité.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify in French today. I always have that choice, and I don't really have the dilemma when I testify in different areas. But in terms of your question, first of all, of course we have to implement these things. Your question was to know how once we determine certain rules to be followed, for example, in terms of respecting human rights, supply chain integrity, traceability of various products. In my opinion, and this is what we do, these are best practices in any case that already exist, and we should not hesitate to implement them, just as we would implement them in any other context if it were any other country. Basically, to do some mapping of your supply chain, to know where you're buying from, and to visit physically or to do virtual audits with your suppliers, to conduct due diligence, to do research online, to go and meet people, ask for information, demand information. This seems to be generally missing. I mean, what I often see when companies deal with China, it's as though, well, because it's a different language, the distance is what it is, the way of doing business is a little different from what's being done in Canada. So it's as though people don't implement what they would normally implement in dealing with another country. So the answer to the question would be stick to good business practice and pursue it to the end. In other words, if you're mapping a supply chain, well, do it. Who do you buy from that's tier 1? Who do they buy from that's tier 2? And then go to tier 3 and tier 4, dig. And you should be able to get the information, visit your suppliers, visit your partners, ask the questions. Ultimately, if you don't get the answers and you're not satisfied in terms of the answers you're being given, well, back off and don't buy and don't invest. There are things that happen. When it becomes generalizations, I think there's a trap. When people say that you designate a whole province as having certain problems, suddenly people are saying we shouldn't buy anything from any province or any region, a particular region or particular province. That is too broad. I think we're losing the sight of the goal of protecting certain people because in wanting to protect certain individuals, we're penalizing others. So to stick to generally recognized sound business practice, I think, is the best way to deal with China. Find people, meet them, and ask questions. Thank you very much. Mr. Burton, in an article recently published in the Toronto Star, you talked about
campaign, which includes conspiracy theories promulgated by pro-Beijing Chinese language media in Canada, threatens our democracy. It already cost Canadian MPs of Chinese heritage their seats in the last election, and because we do nothing about it, we can expect more in the next election. Je comprends que vous faites référence à des députés.
I understand that you were referring to Canadian MPs of Chinese origin who lost their seats at the last election, to the 2021 elections. Now, you know that there was already a debate about the 2019 elections, where the Prime Minister brought the issue up with Xi Jinping but it would seem that it wasn't so serious as all that. So, on what did you base yourself for your statement? As you're tossing a bottle into the sea, whereas there was already the 2019. You're adding to it about what happened or what is alleged to have happened in 2021.
To intercede, Mr. Bergeron, you're out overtime. Mr. Burton, if you have some reflections on this, perhaps we could ask you to submit in writing to our clerk. That would be useful to have that testimony. We now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would also like to express my gratitude to the witnesses for bringing this testimony to us today. It's very, very interesting, and I'm not an investment specialist, so I need to understand this, I guess, a little bit better. Ms. McQuaid-Johnson, you had spoken about, how Germany was sort of the gold standard of the legislation that's been brought forward. We know Canada has not yet brought forward that legislation. I think during your testimony, you also talked a little bit about the possibility of it being policy or legislation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why Germany is considered the gold standard, whether or not we should have this be a policy change leading towards legislation, or whether this is just a solid legislation change. And maybe talk a little bit about if the legislation should be focusing on public dollars, or if it should also be including funds like university and pension funds.
Mr. Chair, for the question, and I'd like to say that what we're seeing is in Germany's approach is putting human rights and ethics at the core of their policy. Having a policy dimension as well as a legislative dimension. I indicated that for Canada, I think that we need something like the entities list in the U.S. that will be a guideline for university trust funds as well as for pension funds as to what they are not permitted to invest in. And those are the obvious genocide companies. It's not a very long list. There are many other companies in China that they could invest in. Having said that, there's a broader question here about the extent to which public pension plans are investing in China when we see the situation with Russia, where Canada chose to sanction Russia along with other countries, and we found that investments in Russia were frozen. I would be very concerned to see a situation where there was a blockade against Taiwan. One of the things on the table among Western countries was whether to have a sanction list for China, and organizations like CPPIB and university trust funds come to the government and say, please, please don't touch all of our important investments in China. We don't want to put them at risk. And that's, I think, one of the things behind proposals such as Charles Burton expressed, which is take another look at all of your investments in China to see whether this is a stable country going forward. We've seen with the COVID numbers that we could find even more severe problems going forward with the supply chains. And so I think, this is something that merits a broader thinking than just the narrow selection of one investment or another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And Mr. Burton, I'll move to you next. I mean, you do talk about the risk to investments. I mean, we're talking right now about doing our due diligence to ensure that there is not forced child labor or slave labor within our supply chains. But what are the risks? I think Ms. McQuaid-Johnson has brought that forward. But what are those risks to Canadian entities if they're invested in China and China, the world geopolitical situation changes? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as confident as Mr. Bro in the trustworthiness of the Chinese Communist regime to enforce our laws as we would hope that they would. I think that, the concern is, of course, China is an unstable environment, and that should factor into any investment decisions. But picking up on what Margaret has said, I'm currently in Berlin attending a conference of 82 countries, 240 delegates, including members of the Canadian Public Service, to try and come up with a coordinated response to Chinese interference activities. And I think that we really need to be working, in concert with other nations, sharing best practices and experiences, and ensuring that we are all on the same page with regard to Chinese investment and many other aspects of our concerns about China's flouting of the international rules-based order in diplomacy and trade. So, there are a lot of implications here, and obviously, if there is a war over Taiwan, that will be devastating to the global economy and to the geostrategic future, including, our participation in the Indo-Pacific. But those questions are pretty broad, and we'll see what happens.
And of course, we like to give you 6 minutes to talk about those those questions. They're a little deep for that. You know what? I have 10 seconds left, so I maybe will just pass that back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and hope you're on the mend this week. We missed you last week.
I'm working on it.
You're getting there? Good for you. Well, Nancy, our clerk, by the way, is sequestered away with having been exposed to COVID, and so she's decided to do us all a favor not to share, which is very nice. We will now go to our second round of questionings. Mr. Seaback, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, in an article from Hong Kong Watch, Passively Funding Crimes Against Humanity, they have a number of recommendations. Ms. McQuaig and Mr. Burton, I think you'll agree with this, but I'm going to ask anyway. I mean, one of the recommendations is, and you've touched on this, draw up a list of banned entities that are known to be involved in state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region, applying this to public procurement, pension, and government investments and imports. So I'd like to ask you both if you agree with that recommendation, and if so, why?
Mr. Chair, I would certainly volunteer that I agree with that. And I have a broader concern as well. We've talked about the groups of funds that CPPIB and others are using that meld a lot of different companies. But CPPIB also invests in Alibaba Group, not just Alibaba Technology. And Alibaba Group is a big umbrella for many, many other companies in China. And we don't know what the human rights situation is in all of those. So that would be another group that I think should be taken off the table.
Yeah, I agree with everything in the Hong Kong Watch report. I think the evidence given last week by Mr. Tokti and Ms. Calvary was golden, and I hope you'll take it into consideration in your report.
So I guess my question really is this. Why is it taking so long for Canada to do this? Do either of you have any insight? If you really wanted to, you just copy the American list. I mean, no, that's not ideal, but at least then we'd have something. Do either of you understand why the glacial pace that this is moving forward with in Canada?
I think that it's very hard for our government to make such a dramatic change. I'd also, we could be similarly doing a Foreign Agencies Registry Act like the United States, or the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act from Australia. And as you say, it's easy to do because the language is there. I'd like to see stronger language in Canadian law with regard to the transfer of classified dual-use military technologies to agents of a foreign state, where our language is not as good as the American or British language, and therefore we have a great deal of difficulty bringing people who have done this sort of appalling activity to justice. We've got a new Indo-Pacific policy out. It's not as strategic as I'd like it to have been, but it's something we're going to work with, and I'm confident that your committee will be holding our government to account to make it serve Canadian interests.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A lot has changed since the Michaels were taken hostage, and Canada's learned a lot about China in that time. The government has come a long way. They walked on eggshells for a very long time. It was frustrating for people like Mr. Burton and myself because we were pushing for stronger action to stand up to China. But the strategy is, in my view, a game changer for this government. And I think we'll see a lot of changes coming on the heels of it. It was only about a week ago that it was brought in. The strategy, in my view, is visionary, and it's a U-turn. And I think it's a leadership role that we can take in Canada with other countries. In my view, and I've said this in an international publication, this is now the model that other countries should be looking towards to take on the new aggressive China that we're seeing, as well as to implement really targeted initiatives that are well-funded. So it's comprehensive and it's well-funded, and I'm really pleased. And I think with that, we'll start to see other changes on the part of the government in this area of pensions as well as other areas.
30 seconds. Just switching quickly to trade and imports in particular, that's my portfolio outside of this. I mean, how hard would it be to draw up a list with respect to imports of banned companies where we should not be importing those goods and products? Because we haven't done it, as far as I'm aware.
I think it's pretty straightforward. We have really excellent trade officers at Global Affairs Canada. They can get some help from the Uyghur community in Canada. I know there's a lot of conversations between Global Affairs and the Uyghur community, and who can highlight particular products that come from an area where it's known to have forced labor. And remember, this is forced labor across China, because the Uyghurs are often sent in groups of tens of thousands to factories in other parts of China, which raises the whole question of what's happening to their children. There are more than 1 million children in indoctrination schools with the same kind of surveillance technology as their parents have, and also 800,000 Tibetan children. So that's another whole layer of human rights abuse that we see in China.
Thank you, Mr. Seaback. We'll now go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes, or pardon me, for 5 minutes or less.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to continue with the last question that Mr. Bergeron had raised. If we could have an answer from Mr. Burton. What evidence do you actually have that a single candidate lost their last election because of Chinese influence? Exactly. What proof do you have?
I have no proof that a single candidate lost their seat because of the last election.
But Mr. Burton, you said that. You said that in testimony to this committee just 20 minutes ago.
No, I haven't said that any candidate has lost their seat. We don't know why people go to the polling station or why they put the X on the candidate that they do. But what I was involved in was Kenny Chiu's disinformation over WeChat, attempting to trace the source of this disinformation that slandered Mr. Chiu and mischaracterized his private member's bill. And we were unable to do so, and we referred this matter to
Would it surprise you, Mr. Burton, that there were hundreds of negative Twitter comments about me in the last campaign by many, many people, but I still won?
I think that, you know, the issue of election interference by the Chinese Communist Party is a well-established policy of the United Front Work Department's operations throughout the world, as coordinated through the embassy and consulates. And, you know, this is nothing particularly new or distinctive to Canada, but it's certainly something that we should stop by, if there are agents who have engaged in illegal activities such as funding of candidates, or if there are diplomats who are coordinating this activity, then I think they should be returned to Beijing.
If there are any signs of influence, absolutely it should be investigated and anyone should be prosecuted. I would agree. But I'll leave that at this point. I want to move on now.
The Affairs Committee will be investigating this matter. I'll be giving evidence to that committee.
I look forward to it. we're hearing a range of views tonight, from a radical decoupling of our economy with the Chinese economy, through to wary, restricted engagement with heavy government influence, to an informed corporate social responsibility model. I would think that that is the range of activity we've heard tonight. And I want to give you each a chance to comment on that. Mr. Burton, you seem to be advocating, based on ideology, a radical decoupling. Ms. McCaig-Johnson, you seem to be advocating a restricted, wary engagement with government engagement and involvement. And Mr. Brault, you seem to be advocating an intelligent, business-minded engagement where businesses, investment bureaus, and pension funds would actually be mitigating their risk if they invested intelligently in good corporate social responsibility. Am I getting the three of you correct? Because we're trying to find a model. Maybe begin with Mr. Brault.
So very quickly, I would hold that position, and I do agree with that position that you introduced. So I do think that there's a lot of noise in the signal between Canada and China, and I would certainly I wish that some of the contribution that I'm bringing here, and I'm not a politician, and I don't follow this topic from a political point of view. I just run businesses, and then as a Canadian, I do carry Canadian values in everything that we do, and I'm very proud of that. And I think the fact I'm testifying here very candidly, I think is also a testimony to that from China, by the way. So what I would like, so I do agree with that position, which is one of saying, let's no matter what we do here, let's stick to best practices, let's stick to facts, let's get the information, let's ask the questions, and if we don't have the questions, we move out, but not after we've asked the question and seen the answers.
Thank you. I'm just going to move to Ms. McCaig-Johnson.
Mr. Chair, I would say yes, the member has me well pegged. I have a cautious approach to business in China. It comes from 5 years of research that I did on Canadian technology company joint ventures in China, where I found that instead of sharing of the joint venture 50-50 or 51-49, it was 90-10 or 80-20 in favor of the Chinese majority joint venture holder, when it was 100% the Canadian technology that was being made. And then over time, the Chinese partner eased out the Canadian partner out of their own joint venture. So I've seen a lot of this. I've seen dozens, more than 3 dozen cases like this that are documented in a document at the China Institute that's published it. So I'm cautious on business issues. I don't take at face value what a supplier to a supplier to a supplier would say about whether there's forced labor in their factory. I'm skeptical, and I do believe there's a government role on important things like human rights and being aligned with our partners as well.
I think that's probably my time.
Mr. Burton, we'll give you half a minute to answer the question as well.
I agree with Margaret's assessment. I think it's the most realistic. I think in terms of decoupling, this is more likely to come from the Chinese side than our side. As the way things are developing in China with regard to Mr. Xi's approach to the market economy, it looks like they'll be closing off to a lot of Canadian business in future. But I think in the meantime, the measures that Margaret is suggesting are excellent.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bergeron, to you for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. In an article that you co-authored in April last, you stated, and I'm quoting approximately Mrs. McQuaid-Johnson, it's time to begin the divestment process from China to avoid being complicit in the adversity that the Chinese government is inflicting upon its own people, to avoid the emerging risks related to Chinese investment, and to not be taken hostage by these investments in future. Are you referring to the Canadian pension funds and investment funds, or are you referring to Chinese investments themselves?
Mr. Chair, I was referring in this case to pension funds, and I co-authored the op-ed with Phil Kretzmar of the Jewish community. The Jewish community understands genocide, and they are very much behind trying to get our public pension funds and university funds out of investments in China. And so it's pension funds that I was referring to. We will always trade with China. They need our products and we need theirs. And our trade, in fact, even during the horror crisis with the Michaels, was still going up. But in terms of our pension funds, I think we need to be cautious.
Merci. Sur ce même...
Thank you. On the same theme, during our last session, we had representatives from the Uyghurs' Rights Defense Project who mentioned, as you have, that investment funds and pension funds in Norway had been invested in Russia, and after the application of the sanctions by Western countries, these funds had been frozen and devalued after the beginning of the Ukraine war. So we're talking about a loss of thousands or millions of dollars on the part of Norwegian investors. Isn't this the kind of risk that we would be taking in investing in China, considering the fact that the question is not to know when China is going to invade Taiwan, rather whether China will be invading Taiwan, but rather when China will be invading Taiwan?
Chair, this is something that deeply concerns me, because I feel that we are so invested in China through our pension funds that they would be a drag on our ability to create positive public policy in a time of a blockade of Taiwan. We should be able to operate as a government without the private sector or the public pension sector putting up big red flags and saying, don't touch our investments in China. They can see very clearly what might possibly happen. And they should be being particularly cautious now and looking at where they can divert their investments from China to other countries in the region, consistent with our Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to the witnesses for being with us today and sharing your expertise. One of the comments that you made earlier, Ms. McQuaid-Johnston, was around the incentivization of human rights. So you talked about how currently, or people who run funds and run the CPP are incentivized for profit, for their performance is evaluated on that particular framework. What would it look like? How would that look? How would we incorporate an incentivization for human rights into this work?
This would have to be done by the pension boards themselves in setting the standards for how their managers are remunerated. We know that they value good corporate governance, ESG, but we're not seeing it in the behaviors. So we need to start to see it in pension funds reducing their and actually getting out of their investments in big companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Newsoft, which are clear genocide companies. And we should not be in those. I'd like to see a day when we're not in any of those directly, and we have a public policy to not invest in these broader roll-up trust funds.
That's great, thank you. Well, and one of the things that I think we have to consider here is we're talking about legislation. So of course, even though this is the Canada-China Committee, legislation would not just apply, of course, to China. This would be legislation that would be in place for forced labor around the world, for supply chains around the world. So looking at that list of that entities list that you've brought forward, would we have an opportunity to work with our like-minded countries, with allies, to develop that list? Could we build on lists that have already been developed by other countries? Is that something that you could see as a reasonable expectation?
I think that's a real opportunity, actually. For example, Canada is the host of most of the mining companies. And so this is something where we should be taking a leadership and ensuring there's no forced labor in any of the mining companies that are registered in Canada. That should be straightforward, and it should be part of this legislation that you're considering.
Thank you. And just finally...
I'm sorry, Ms. McPherson, you are well out of time.
I am out of time. Thank you.
Are. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their time tonight. It's been very enlightening, as all witnesses seem to be, so thank you very much. We will now suspend because we have some committee business to attend to, and that will be done in camera, so we'll suspend as of right now.